Any questions from the readings, your life, the class? That's right, it's class, not counselor. You're able to get the PowerPoints, etc. up front? Okay, all right. Adjusting the lights. Let's see. All right. When we talk about collateral data, public statistics, the reason we often use them, even though statistics bore people, they actually are useful data at some point. And I'm going to be doing a part of this. I don't know that we'll go through a significant portion of the 90 slides that make up this, but I figured you'd use the body of work just so you know what we're going to talk about. So the statistic, you may have heard me say 80% of the legal drug users. Now, where that came from, that's when the Reagans were saying just say no. When they were saying just say no, 80% of the illegal drug users were white men who made in excess of $50,000. Okay? Now, where that came from, actual statistic, the household survey. Now, what that is a phone survey of adult drug use. They call people up and they ask them what's their drug use in the household, and they ask as many adults as there are in there. So you may think that people will lie, but having done research design, there's ways of designing for people exaggerating. And so that's where that statistic came from. And the statistic has basically hovered within 10 or 20% of that. No audio signal?
No, they're hearing it through the ceiling mics.
Okay. All right. Okay. You're hearing me okay, Cottage Grove?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So, the household survey they do every year or every couple of years, so that statistic has basically remained true essentially. Is that a question? Oh.
Can you hear us?
I can hear you, so you should mute the mic at your end except when you want to do a question. Thank you. So basically when I was saying 80% of illegal drug users, the stat for, okay, so that's white men, so white women are about 13% of that number. All minorities in aggregate are 7% of that number, just so that rounds it out. And so, for example, even though when the stereotype is of the black crack addict, that's 3% of the folks. Well, not even 3% of the folks, because it's all illegal drugs all together, and crack is going to be a segmented part of that, right? So that was back in the 80s, right? So in the 90s and the aughts, and the household survey, I think, lags about 3 years behind, roughly. So then, when you segment the collateral data, like monitoring the future is K through 12. Now, when I first started looking at this data and talking about, okay, how do we design for prevention for different folks? Because obviously, if the national approach is just say no, well, that doesn't work. It actually didn't work for white people. So, no, not if 80% of them are rich and basically not going to jail. They're not saying no, clearly. So what's going to work? So a number of us decided to look at, okay, if we're focusing on prevention and the K through 12, so the monitoring the future is the federal study, and various states do their own studies within middle school and high school, usually like 6th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade. And then the core survey, which is basically 2 and 4 year schools, And then there are other things like for kiddies, like weekly reader survey when it existed, the Pride survey, which is basically looking at elementary school in particular. So the idea behind statistics, right? Statistics are the stories of human suffering with the pain removed. And the idea behind that really is that the person in front of you that you are training to deal with is part of those statistics, but they're a real human person with a real story in front of you, and you can basically connect them. It is a therapeutic technique to connect them to a larger body of suffering, but that still doesn't necessarily help me become clean and sober, one day at a time. But it is useful to understand, okay, there is a structure that's keeping this in place. There's an above ground economy, there's an underground economy, right? So when we look at this collateral damage, numbers do tell a story. To illustrate the story, you have to use a specific person. And that's part of the idea behind the biopsychosocial recon, is either talk about a person that exists or create a person out of scratch. Now, when I talked about Carmen Brightrobe and Tony Soprano the other day, those are real people that I just changed the name, because their stories were illustrative of what actually shows up at Lane Community College, which, being fairly typical from the numbers, is still how do you deal with the individual in terms of keeping them clean and sober. So how does it fit into the larger picture? So you're also training for a profession where you're going to experience other people's trauma vicariously. You might be able to pick, and what that means is you might be able to pick up on it and acknowledge it before they're ready to. And that's okay. Whole other unit, huh?
Yeah,
Okay.
sorry to bother you. Well, that's a different
Oh,
problem.
that's another problem. What is it, Friday the 13th?
It seems like it.
Post full moon stress disorder for the electronics?
This should work.
All right. Okay. Always trust your crew. All right, so you'll be able to actually pick up on this kind of stuff before they admit that they're going through it. So yeah, be able to ask the right questions. Have I shown you this equation before? Okay. All right. This is part of what I call an emotional equation. And how it works is basically like algebra. It's not just mathematical computation, it's emotion. It's basically a way of problem solving where you already have the answers internally. And so if you use it in a counseling sense, so algebra means the mending. And the image is of a broken stick. And what you do to this side of the stick, you got to do to that side of the stick. What you do above, you got to do below. And you start at the hardest place. You do the hardest thing first. So in order of operations in algebra, right? Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, right? Parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Right? You start at the hardest place first and you work in a line until you get the correct answer. Now, if you apply this to counseling, you have to go to the center of the greatest pain first. Or the greatest pain that they are willing to acknowledge. Okay, you have to be willing to go there whether they're not. And you also have to have gone there yourself, because you can't lead where you don't go. You can't teach what you don't know. All right? So to translate this into a counseling framework, pain, loss, fear, depression, anger, serenity. You can't get to serenity until you acknowledge the pain first. Now, what that is, A minus E in parentheses with N, so it's anger, denied expression, multiplied, becomes depression. So it's an equation for depression, because many times, especially with substance abuse, people with abuse histories, they're depressed. And a lot of times, and not all depression is like this, but this is the way to bet. If there has been some kind of abuse where people are self-medicating. Usually they can't, so so the idea then, anger, denied expression, A minus E. Anger usually comes from hurt. And sometimes you can acknowledge it at the moment, and sometimes you can't. So if you're being abused, you're being hurt by somebody more powerful than you, you may or may not be, might not be safe for you to express that anger. It still wants to go somewhere, so you stuff it. It actually takes more energy to stuff it than is in the anger, so if you're stuffing it successfully, right? But it's still in there raging somewhere, and so what happens is you have less energy to live, so you feel down. You feel depressed. Right? So some forms of depression are sublimated anger. Now, when I put this in parentheses, anger, denied expression, and N in algebra means, because you're solving for N means some number. And so it doesn't really even matter what number you plug in there, because in previous, well, certainly last term, when we talked about this, emotional equations, let's plug in 50. And let's put in a story. So let's say that I was abused 50 times that I can count. And I'm going to make the assumption that I can't remember all the times that I was abused, but if I got abused on certain dates, and I know that it happened, how did I feel about it? Well, I don't feel anything anymore. That's in the past. Why go wah, wah, wah? No, you're stuffing it. It's there. You just ain't talking about it because you had the experience of not talking about it to anybody and not being able to admit it. So you just gave up on talking about it, even to yourself. So so this equation was actually developed by somebody that was first doing cutting and then doing suicide attempts from being abused. Okay? Violence, reacting to violence by turning the violence inside. And so, yeah, other people can understand people are depressed and they want to be and they're suicidal, but not to see that suicide is an attempt to escape abuse, where the abuser is a parent and you can't inform on them because they're in this particular case, a Mormon bishop. So you can't actually disclose the abuse because then the whole family gets excommunicated and you don't get to go live in your special planet or whatever the worldview is. Right? So, lots of little stories like that. So, not all of them like that. So let's say that N is 50 times. Yeah, they're depressed. So, how do you solve the equation? You generate an expression that's safe. You talk about it with somebody. You journal it. You get it out in art. You express it. You do appropriate healing, depending on what kind of wound it is, because there's a wounding that's happened. That's why your anger. Anger comes from hurt. So what is the nature of the injury? I mean, if you want to think about it in terms of, is it a cut? Is it a bruise? Is it a burn? Did you break something? How do you heal it properly? right? So that's why you go with Pilfdas, pain. What's the pain? What's the wounding? What did you lose? What are you grieving? Are you grieving the loss of your innocence or the death of your innocence? Pain, loss, and fear. What do you fear to lose? What do you fear? How do you fear being hurt? Are you depressed? Pain, loss, fear, depression, anger. Are you in touch with your anger? So I've done S could be serenity, but S could be also shame, which can lead me to another equation that I haven't put up here that I just actually came up with today, which is A plus S equals G. So anger plus shame is guilt. Guilt feels like you've done something wrong and you should be punished. Right? So you feel angry, but you're directing the anger at yourself, or you're directing the anger at the people making you feel guilty, who are making you feel shamed. But the shame makes you feel like I need to be punished, I did something wrong, even though you might not have done anything wrong, but these people are saying, you're nothing, you're worthless. So you feel guilty, and you may even feel guilty because, well, I don't feel worthless. So this becomes an interesting equation too. So just a different way of thinking it in terms of mathematical terms, where you substitute letters for emotions and break up different things that you're feeling into their component parts. So to think of guilt as partially anger and partially shame. So you could also say in some frameworks that anger is basically a combination of hurt and fear. In Navajo way, they basically say, okay, hurt, fear, or sadness and fear. All right, so you get to the component emotions within the therapy. So part of the collateral damage we're talking about is what's driving the addictive behavior. So people, for example, may report being depressed, but we're suppressing their anger at being abused in that particular equation. So abuse may have happened for so long it might have become normal, and they might have also forgotten a lot of the abuse as a survival mechanism. That's partially what happens with PTSD. It's actually a natural part of the brain functioning where something so terrible happened that you can't be the person that went through that, so you block it out to process it later. All right. So, for example, then, oppression and powerlessness might be a common experience, and some people don't need to, quote unquote, like they talk about within the 12-step framework, admit we're powerless, because they've always been powerless within the context that we live in within society. So their substances or processes become means of coping with hopelessness, despair, and fear. So instead of dealing with the ability to face your fear and despair with courage, because that skill isn't necessarily taught, but we want to teach them that within our counseling frameworks. So what happens is they'll dull it. So they and others will pay the price or will pay the price for that choice. So now it's only a choice if you are consciously aware that there are options. Okay? If you are role modeled that the only way to cope with this is by using, you're not aware that there is a choice. And also, basically dealing with drug withdrawals, if you're a junkie or something, basically you're dope sick, you don't have time to think about the choice. You want to get the next fix. That's where you're at. And you're basically avoiding pain to do that. So, if the awareness of options is hidden from you, then you act out what is available or popular. And popular doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. It just means it's what people are doing as normal behavior. So one of the things I talk about is induced ignorance addictions. So addiction depends on the concealment of the truth, and without sounding too new agey, the idea is the whole truth is you're a capable being. You have the wisdom of the universe inside you already. Addictions reinforce the illusion that you do not possess those inner resources. So there are addictive organizations, social structures, policy, and practice ensure addictions will continue by creating dependence on outer solutions to inner problems, rather than develop or even acknowledge that there are inner resources. So it's easier, and it's been made easier within our society to depend on those outer solutions. Case in point, an induced ignorance. So, what is the safe and effective dose for aspirin, ibuprofen, acetaminophen? Basically, your NSAID painkillers.
200 milligrams.
Okay, and where do you find that?
On the bottle.
On the bottle. Okay, so what is the safe and effective dose of alcohol for social lubrication? Well, it's difficult to even think of it like that. So our present drug laws, which, if you want, we can talk about, but not now, because the slides are later on, way later. And our present drug laws, the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, I was in 10th grade when this was passed. Alcohol and tobacco were in the original law. Because basically, a Schedule I drug was a drug that had clear abuse potential but no medical use. Did we have an alcohol and tobacco problem in 1970? Yes, we did. Was it killing millions of people? Yes, it was. Well, it was in the original law, and they lobbied it out. Okay? And did a thing called, remember I called myself a policy wonk? What we policy wonks call preemption. If our local community wanted to have the information I'm going to show you printed on the bottle, we can't do it. It takes a law of Congress, an act of Congress, to actually have this on there. So essentially what we have is an induced ignorance addiction, where George Bush, the first, defined alcohol as a drug. Augustus Bush the fourth, that is the CEO of Anheuser-Busch, doesn't want you to think of alcohol as a drug. He wants you to think of it as a lifestyle choice. That's a quote. Okay? So, safe and effective dose of alcohol for social lubrication. In other words, an anxiety-reducing, judgment and coordinating, preserving dose of alcohol. So according to the same principles of pharmacology that give us dosages for NSAIDs, that would be 0.02.
That'd be 2 drinks?
No. 0.02 blood alcohol level, or blood alcohol concentration. It depends on your body weight. Just like the dosages here are calculated for an adult, okay, by blood volume. So this becomes a curious thing in terms of looking at your ideal body weight. Now, where your ideal body weight comes from is the life insurance industry, who calculates that people who are within a certain mean or average body weight live longer. And that's where that comes from. So technically at 205 pounds for being 5'7" and 5'8.5", I'm like 30 pounds overweight in that framework. Right? My scale says, okay, you're 31, all right, so I'm a little obese. Well, this obese? Well, that's obese. All right? So the idea is, and that doesn't necessarily mean you can drink more, but okay. So how much is that for you? That information could be printed on the container. So how much is too much? So here's how we get around with that. So induced ignorance addiction goes like this. We have a term that comes out of the medical field called binge drinking. And what that is 4+ doses in a 2-hour period for women, 5+ doses in a 2-hour period for men. Now this definition has changed over the years. They used to say 4 doses at a setting, but then, you know how college students are. They're like street lawyers. Well, what's a setting? Like, shut up. How long does it take you to drink a 6-pack? If you're drinking in a 6-pack in an hour, do you really take, get real, Joe 6-pack, I mean, who's actually drinking a case. How long does it take you to drink that case? How long does it take someone to drink a 5th of vodka, physically? Right, so that varied. So we'll say within a 2-hour period. So this particular meme, alcohol being consumed in less harmful doses according to, basically this has been discarded, but I'm saying this is, you know, in the 20 years that I've been here, this is where the evolution of thinking in higher ed, higher ed, yeah, goes, right? The 0124 protocol, that is, and they call that low risk drinking. That is, no use if you're below the legal age, i.e. 21, no family, if you have no family history of alcoholism, if you're not pregnant, if you don't have any mental or physical illnesses made worse by alcohol, but if you do have those things, you shouldn't drink. How many people follow that, right? Then, if you've passed that test, then 1 dose per hour and no more than 2 doses in a setting, and doing that more than 4 days in a row.
What's a dose?
We'll get to that. And this is where we have often the challenge between the medical definition and what actually happens. Okay? All right, so for example, along the lines of the top, so alcohol's a drug. Drugs come in doses. 1 dose of alcohol is, and this is where you have to actually drill down into the story that they're telling you when they say they've drunk too much. So you say, how many doses? Because essentially all our alcohol problems come from an intentional overdose. Okay? If you ate half a bottle of aspirin, we would clearly see that as a suicide attempt. Why is it that we think that drinking a case of beer is normal behavior when the consequences could be fatal? Who did that programming? All right? So 1 dose, 12 ounces of regular beer, and I'm defining regular beer as 2% beer, Bud Light. Okay, your normal, regular American beer. But people don't necessarily drink that. They'll drink their IPAs, they'll drink their Terminators, they'll drink whatever. So anything that's stronger than 2%, which has to be marked as either a malt liquor or an IPA or a craft beer, which starts at anywhere between 5 to 8% or higher, the dosage on that is 7 ounces. Therefore, if you drink a pint, you understand that a pint is 16 ounces. A pint is actually 2 doses. But the person is thinking of it as a drink because they've been carefully programmed by the tobacco hall drug dealers as thinking as the drink, a drink as the container, and still marketing multiple dose containers as a single serving. Okay? So 12 ounces of regular beer, 2-point beer, 7 ounces of microbrew, 5 to 8 or greater so 7 ounces is of that strength is a dose per dose. So a shot 1.5 ounces, and 4 to 5 ounces of regular wine, 3 to 4 ounces of fortified wine. Fortified wine, your night trains, your, etc., your high test wines. So the idea is many doses in one container. So for example, Long Island iced tea, an AMF, multiple doses in a container. Right? Fifth of vodka, the reason I mentioned that, fifth of vodka, fifth of Jacks, that's essentially 17 doses. So malt liquor, so a 40 ounce of malt liquor, 2 liter bottle, 40 ounce of malt liquor is 5.5 doses. 40 ounce of malt liquor is essentially just less than a 6-pack. Because it's higher strength, even though it's less material. Wine cooler, 10 doses, and it's actually 10 to 16 doses, depending on whether you do the 4 to 5 ounces. And basically, I'm talking about like California coolers. And the reason I mention that is there's a story from out of the high school days where a woman was drinking 2 2-liter bottles. So, client once just reported actually a week or two ago about drinking 5 tall boys, right, of IPA. Okay, that IPA was 5 to 6, right? So 3 doses in a 24-ounce can. And he's drinking 4 of them. You do the math, right? So this becomes normal behavior, right? Because you're socialized to think of the drink as the container and not necessarily think of it as a drug, even though you know it's affecting you. So then what happens? So if all alcohol problems come from essentially overdosing, and alcohol-related diseases come from habitually overdosing, binge drinking, so to an addictions counselor, moderate drinking means, this is the medical definition, 1 dose a day for women. If she's not pregnant, then it's 0. And 2 doses a day for men. That's moderate drinking. Yeah.
But doctors still tell you you can drink.
Word. Not drug counselors. There is no safe dosage of alcohol for a fetus. None. 0, zip. Now, there are people like George W. Bush who can function as president while being, Barbara drank during his pregnancy. Okay, so and he had a heavy drinking problem himself. Not high functioning on the intellectual level, but, he can function within the parameters of being president. Sort of. Well, with help. Okay, so this is moderate drinking. Yeah, I know. There are still docs that are telling, not my sister, who's an OBGYN in Portland, or not Portland, Brooklyn.
I went to a geneticist, and she even said, she's like, oh, it's fine. Like, why do you say that?
Yeah, right. Well,
they say that 1 glass of red wine is good for the baby's heart.
yeah, actually, it's the resveratrol is in grape juice, not wine. So let's go there. Right, I know, they say that. And so that's why I'm saying these are induced ignorance addictions, where you're creating problems by accepting the norms of addictive organizations. And I'm not down with that at all. Right? In Indian country, we understood that the fetus could be harmed by alcohol 4,000 years ago, but America didn't invent the concept of fetal alcohol syndrome until 1978. Didn't even consider alcoholism a disease until 1956. So, yeah.
And we still don't recognize fetal alcohol syndrome unless there's facial abnormalities.
Right. Okay. What happened with George W. Bush is he's in the spectrum, fetal alcohol and other drugs spectrum disorder. Okay. Recognizing that very few people are just going to be devoted to one drug. They often use multiple drugs. Go ahead.
Now, if considering the whatever appropriate dose, the 2 doses a day for men, if you were doing that on a daily basis, isn't there a possibility of you getting withdrawals from not drinking for a day still?
There's a possibility, but it's not likely.
Yeah.
Because remember, using that definition of what we call the dose.
Yeah.
Okay?
So, like,
And I'm about to show you what that blood alcohol chart looks like.
okay.
Because people don't know. Right? They just know how they feel without understanding that how you feel is a function of your nervous system, which was designed to adapt to reoccurring conditions. Okay, also, that's moderate drinking if you're not on medications which are potentiated by alcohol, like other sedative hypnotic drugs or opiates. So for example, remember Tony Soprano? He's a bottle of wine a day drinker that was experiencing anxiety disorder, but probably what that was, he reported anxiety when he didn't drink. So he's probably going through alcohol withdrawal and interpreting that as anxiety, which is a normal part of alcohol withdrawal. But the docs didn't question that and then gave him meds that are potentiated by alcohol, even though they told him and the pharmacist told him he drank his usual, bottle of wine on top of his meds and had a Dewey. All right, so anything else is not moderate drinking. So responsible drinking, which the drug dealers, I'm sorry, they're drug dealers. I don't really see any need to give them props. They're like the cartel. Their body count is higher than the cartel. And you'll be seeing that. So responsible drinking. Notice when they say drink responsibly, they are not giving you a specific blood alcohol amount, ever. Think before you drink. Well, wait, if you drink too much, you're not capable of thinking. Right? Responsible drinking is not moderate drinking, either. So, for example, come on. If every person in the U.S. between the ages of 8 and 80 only drank 2 alcoholic drinks on Friday and Saturday, alcohol consumption would drop 40%. So I would say substitute with what Leeds was saying about drinks, I would say doses, but that's me. So obviously the alcohol industry would lose money if you did that, and obviously if the only people who drank were of legal